of this workshop is that everybody basically knows everybody else's work, and therefore there's almost no reason to introduce the speakers. As we saw from the last few talks, and also from yesterday, Yoram Erder's work, both in history of Karaism, in Halakha, Karaite Halakha, the relationship between Karaism and Second Temple groups or literature, and in exegesis is obviously well known because it keeps on being mentioned over and over again in this workshop. Yoram teaches at Tel Aviv University, and today he'll be talking about interpretation of biblical stories of qisas, the case of King David's census as interpreted by Yefet Ben-Eli.
Thank you very much. ראשית, אני מודה גם לאכסניה וכמובן לכל האנשים שעוסקים במלאכה. And now to my subject. It is well known that the Karaite sages who were active during the period of the Geonim inclined towards the plain meaning of the text in their interpretation of the commandments. Under the influence of Mu'tazila doctrine, they believed that the commandments were revealed according to their plain sense so that each and every Jew would be able to fulfill them. Our discussion, however, will not focus on the Karaite interpretation of the commandments, but rather on the interpretation of one of the biblical narratives, the census of David that took the census that David took of the nation and the punishment that was placed on the nation afterwards. 2 Samuel 24, 1 Chronicles 21. Yefet Ben-Eli is the only Karaite sage from the Geonic period whose commentary on the Bible remains mostly extant. We'll therefore examine the interpretive methodologies of the Karaites to the narratives in the Bible through him. An examination of the commentaries on biblical narratives shows that due to moral values that he acquired from the Mu'tazila, he allowed himself to interpret biblical stories against their plain meaning in order to reconcile them with his own values. Therefore, on the one hand, the Mu'tazila influence caused Karaites to move towards the plain meaning of biblical commandments. On the other hand, it also caused them to become distant from the plain meaning in their exegesis of the biblical narrative. One of the important ideas of the Mu'tazila was the concept that God is just judge who acts justly with his creation in both this world and the world to come, Adel. But in the story of the census, King David himself admits before God that he had sinned by carrying out the census and already challenged the punishment of the nation, quoting, "I alone am guilty. I alone have done wrong. But these poor sheep, what they have done, let your hand fall upon me and not in my father's house." 2 Samuel 24. Despite these clear words, Yefet saw fit to completely acquit the nation, saw fit not to completely acquit the nation for their sins. This was in order to justify the punishment that was placed upon it. There are several other topics that were discussed among Jews in the Geonic period under the influence of Islam that are relevant here. For example, the Muslims, especially the Shiites, maintained that the prophets were completely immune to sin, Isma. Moshe Zucker has already shown that Yefet Ben-Eli adopted the Islamic principle of prophetic immunity to sin. And we will later see the way that Yefet dealt with these questions of the sin of David, who was considered by him to be a prophet. Similarly, it is necessary to examine the question of David's sin in his theft of Bathsheba from her husband and his murder. The Bible says about David, "For David has done what was pleasing to the Lord and had never turned throughout his life from all that he had commanded him, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. 1 Kings 15:5. We have already seen above that David himself admitted his sin when he ordered a census of the nation to be taken. How can the verse ascribe only one sin to him? Among the answers to this question, Yefet suggested a differentiation between major sin and minor sin, kabaya saraya, which was accepted in Islam. While we are examining the solution suggested by Yefet to these topics, we will also relate to the contemporaneous rabbinic discussion represented by Saadia Gaon, who sought a middle road between rabbinic midrash and Mu'tazili principle. Before we begin to examine the moral value positions that the story of the census raised, it is also necessary to say some words on Yefet ben Eli interpretation of the half-shekel commandments, Exodus 30, 11, 16. This was discussed in both Rabbanite and Karaite interpretation in the discussion of David's census. I wrote an article about it in Megillot. The Karaite interpretation on the half-shekel commandment, which was completely different from that of our sages, is what caused them to adopt a completely different starting point from the Talmudic sages and the Rabbinic interpretation that followed them in a discussion of the census that we will be examining here. The Torah portion, qisas, opens with the contribution of the half-shekel. On the basis of the accounts of qisas and Pekudei, our sages established that the commandment of the half-shekel was given for all generations, mitzvah ledorot, but without any relation to the census. In the words of Maimonides, and the details of the commandments were already explained in a tract especially devoted to it. This is the tractate Shkalim. All Masechet was devoted to Shkalim in Seder Moed. According to the view of the Karaites, for whom Yefet serves here as a spokesman, the payment was exclusively for the purposes of taking census of the people by divine commandment. One should not pay a half shekel except at the time that the entire nation is being counted, and the entire nation is only counted by divine commandment. In their view, these conditions were met only in the 3 censuses that God commanded to the nation to undergo in the desert. And from that, we see that Israel was only required to donate the half shekel during these 3 specific instances of the history. It arises clearly that according to Yefet ben Eli, the nation was exempt from paying the half shekel during the census imposed by David, and it is impossible to claim that they were punished for not doing so. And so, as we will see, Yefet suggested a different explanation for the nation's punishment. As for our sages, Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachmani, for example, argued that the nation was punished because they didn't pay the half shekel. I am quoting, "It is written, and each man gave the atonement of the soul. And there was no plague while they were counted. But in the time of David, because they didn't give, they did have a plague." What caused David to refrain from demanding a half shekel from the nation during the census? Our sages asked. One of them inferred from the verse of Samuel, 1 Samuel 26, that David called God an inciter, messit. And as a punishment for this, God caused David to stumble in the sin. I am quoting, "I will make thee stumble over a thing which even school children know, namely that which is written when you take a census of the Israelite people according to their enrollment, each shall pay the Lord an atonement of his soul." Now, how Yefet saw the sin and the punishment. Before the discussion of the sin and its punishments, Yefet dealt with the circumstances. Yes, circumstances very important, according to Meira, that brought David to sin. In 1 Chronicles says, Satan arose against Israel. According to Yefet, there are those who interpret Satan in this case as sins. Yefet is inclined to the view that the census took place after Avshalom revolt. David's weakening, holding on the power, caused fear among his household. They wanted to determine who stood on the side of the house of David and who opposed it, and thought that David would be able to keep more control over the nation through the census. Regarding the question of what sin David did, it is clear from the legal analysis of the half shekel above that the lack of payment of half shekel during the census was not at all a relevant factor for Yefet, since according to his view, the nation was only obliged to pay half shekel during the time of the desert. In addition, Yefet saw fit to argue with those who affirmed that the nation was punished because they didn't give half shekel. They say the punishment was because they didn't give half shekel. Yefet rejects this claim for the following reasons. Firstly, it is not written that the nation didn't pay the half shekel. Second, the implication of the words of the Torah is that the failure to pay half shekel causes a plague at the time of the census itself. Since the plague came after the census that David took, it follows that the punishment did not come about because of the uprooting of this commandment. Thirdly, the commander of the army, Yoav, son of Tzuriah, would not have opposed something that is permissible, jais. Rather, he knew that it was a forbidden mamnu. By the way, you have to... I forgot. David took the guilt upon himself. What you saw here, this is a way of the Karaites to advocate their way of understanding the commandments by stories. It's goes in the both ways. According to Yefet, David, the one who committed the sin, could have saved the entire nation from God's anger had he expressed regret at the time. This claim for itself show the degree to which David was responsible for the punishment that was placed on the nation. I am quoting, it is said that he regretted after it was all over, and it is written, but afterward David reproached himself, and David said to the Lord, I have sinned grievously for what I have done. And if he would have repented prior to that, the anger would have abated. The end of the quote. In this light of David's sin and his lack of regret at the time, the unfairness of the punishment that was brought on the people is greatly highlighted, because they were the ones who were punished. Yefet thus presents the question of how this can be reconciled with the principle of divine justice, Adel. And now you can see, look at the paper number A. Now the people ask, how can this be reconciled with the divine justice that God would send a disaster for a sin that happened earlier, and the disaster would fall on that did not sin, and the one who didn't sin would come out in peace. And this is not the way things are done, and investigations refutes it. End of the quotation. Actually, it's not that. Okay. In order to prove that in our story the principle of Adel was not uprooted, Yefet did not hesitate to implicate the nation as well against the plain meaning of the verse. And now this is number A. And the solution to this question is that the nation was also liable to be punished because they shouldn't have submitted to this, since it is not proper to count the nation in the light of what we explained above, unless it is commanded by God. And since it was not under one of these conditions, rather only because they thought positively about the king and did what he said without questioning or investigating, the anger was against them. It's like Sartre and Camus, the achrayut ishit. The anger was against them because of this, and there is no deviation here from justice. وَلَيْسَ سَمَا أُدُولْ مِنَ الْعَدَلِ. We see from here that according to Yefet, the nation should not immediately accept the command of the king. Rather, they are obliged to investigate whether his direction conform to divine command. How bureaucracy can work like this, I don't know. In light of the determination that the nation was also implicated in the sin, Yefet determined that one should not understand David's words and the sheep, what did they do, according to the simple meaning. And now I am source number 2. And regarding the words of David, but these poor sheep, what have they done? It is not possible that his intention was to vindicate them from the sin in all senses. Rather, he intended to say that in the roots of the matter, since they came to be counted because I demanded it, their intention was not sinful or at the root of the matter. And his words were in the manner of supplication, that God should remove the plague from them, and it is not possible that he said that in the manner of determining fact in front of God, since it is reprehensible action that requires punishment. In addition to this, Yefet saw fit to note that the nation did not sin purposefully. I quote, and the nation failed to do what it was obliged to do. However, they didn't intend to do this purposefully. Despite the nation's sin, there remains the question of why only the nation was punished. Since David's sin was greater and he was not punished, Yefet proposed 3 answers to the question. And regarding David being left alive, there are 3 possibilities. It is possible that according to God, the plague falls on the one who is counted rather than the one who orders the counting. And therefore, the punishment for the matter didn't apply to David. It is possible that God exempted him because he quickly admitted his sin, and were anyone else to admit their sin the way he did, they would have been saved just as David was. And since they accepted upon themselves to follow the commandment of the king and were counted, the anger fell on them. Again, the nation is to be blamed. Now about Saadia Gaon. That was also Mu'tazalit. Saadia Gaon followed in the footsteps of our sages in his interpretation of the half-shekel commandment. He understood it to be an annual tax and discounted it from the census. At the same time, the Mu'tazila valued led him to different interpretation that of our sages in the story of David's census. According to Rav Mevaser, who devoted a book to criticizing Saadia Gaon, the Gaon attributed to David the mistaken explanation of the sin and its punishments. I'm quoting, and what we found in his commentary to Kitisa, he said, and if one were to come and say, we saw that David said, was it not alone was it not I alone who ordered the numbering of the people? I alone am guilty? And this teaches us that the plague comes at every time the nation is being counted, unless they collect the half shekel. We will answer this was the, so now Mevaser say, we will answer that this was the reasoning of David, who imagined to himself that the sin was because of the counting, but this is not reality. Yes, according to Saadia Gaon, also David didn't understand what is going on. Saadia Gaon viewed David as a prophet. Saadia saw prophecy in every word of the Psalms and contended with those who thought that David wrote them himself under the divine inspiration. How could it be that David would be mistaken regarding the reason for the punishment? The answer of the Gaon, according to Mevaser, was that a prophet could be mistaken in a time when he was not acting as in a mission. I'm quoting, and a proof for this that the prophet could have a false imagination that he is not on a mission, Risala. Mevaser challenged this interpretation. Just as it is impossible that a prophet can imagine a false imagination while acting as an emissary, and if he does make a mistake while acting as an emissary, the master of the universe will not leave him to his mistake and will rather explain to him his will on that matter. So too it is impossible that a prophet will make a mistake on a matter relating to the commandments, and God will leave him to his mistake. This is the words of Mevaser. Not only did Saadia Gaon take the view that David was mistaken in his understanding of the sin of the census, he even vindicated him entirely from sin and placed the blame on the nation entirely against the plain meaning of the verse. In the Gaon view, the sin was the great amount of support the people gave to Avshalom in his revolt against his father. There is no doubt that Saadia Gaon placed the blame of the nation in order to grapple with the principle of divine justice. The Gaon Shmuel ben Chofni, who was also influenced by the Mutazila, followed in the footsteps of Saadia Gaon in his commentary to our story. David didn't understand the sin and its punishment. In actuality, the nation was punished because of its active participation in Avshalom revolt. Now to the sin of Bathsheba. We saw above that Yefet ben Eli, as opposed to Saadia Gaon and Samuel ben Chofni, did not completely remove the sin from David in the story of the census. And yet, in 1 King 16, it is written that David sinned only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Below we will see how Yefet explained David's sin in the matter of Bathsheba, and the distinction he drew between this sin and the other sin of David committed, including the sin of the census. He does this in order to deal with the verse that attributed only one sin to David. In order to understand the following discussion, it is necessary to outline a few points about the principle of prophet immunity to sin that was debated in the discussion of the portion of Bathsheba. The principle of the prophet immunity to sin was already mentioned in the comment of Saadia Gaon above, and from the gloss of Mevaser on it. On one hand, Saadia Gaon exempted David from the sin of the census, and Shmuel ben Chofni followed in his footsteps. It was the nation that sinned, and they were punished justly. On the other hand, Saadia Gaon claimed that David the prophet misunderstood the sin of the census and attributed it to himself because it is possible for the prophet to make a mistake when he is not presently acting as an emissary. Mevasser denied the words of the Gaon by advancing the principle that the prophet never sins. An examination of Muslim discourse in Shiite and Mu'tazili circles that believed in prophetic immunity shows us that one of the central points of debate was whether a prophet is immune to sin only while in the act of prophesying or all the days of his life. The other central question that was discussed in Muslim circles, which find expression in the discussion presented by Yefet below on the topic of David's sin regarding Bathsheba, is if the prophet is immune only by major sin or if he also immune to minor sins as well. Yefet ben Eli was a strong proponent of the principle of prophet immunity to sin, as Zucker noted, and therefore explained a good deal of effort to limit to the extent possible the sin of Moses and Yonah. His position regarding the two major topics that were discussed regarding a prophet immunity to sin is presented most explicitly in his commentary to number 2012. How much time I have? I have. Okay. From Yevet's perspective, the discussion of David's level of immunity to sin is very relevant because, like Saadia Gaon, he viewed David as a prophet. Psalm 51 discussed David's sin. That Psalm 51 is dealing with the sin of David in the Bathsheba case. Psalm 51 discuss David's sin with Bathsheba, as it stated in the opening line, a psalm of David when Nathan the prophet came to him after he had come to Bathsheba. In this commentary to the psalm, Yefet also discusses David's prophecy. In his commentary to the opening statement, Yefet teaches us that David finished prophesying at the end of Psalm 41. In his commentary to verses 13-14, Yefet say, David sought from God that he wouldn't take a vengeance on him by removing from him the Holy Spirit, Ruach HaKodesh. In Yefet's view, the Holy Spirit is the second level of prophecy, as a social on the scale of 6 or 7 levels, and David reached this level in writing the Psalms. In this subject, Haggai ben Shammai and Daniel LASKER dealt. Despite David's apparent status as a prophet, who was generally immune to sin, Yefet did not hesitate, and this is very interesting. Despite they say that the prophet is immune, Yefet didn't hesitate to emphasize in very way the sin of David with Bathsheba. He does so in 2 different ways. One is the exoneration of all the other characters in the narrative. Secondly, all the characters, it means Bathsheba, Uriah, and Yoav ben Tzuriah. In addition, he emphasized the severity of David's action. Here I shall give one example regarding Uriah Hittite. Yefet, following the parable of Nathan, the prophet, rejects the view that David saved Bathsheba from Uriah the sinner. And this description refutes the word of those who say that Uriah was a sinner and he took Bathsheba with force. And in this he made an act of oppression. And David did what should be done by removing her from his hands and could not find a way to do so beside for killing Uriah. Yefet found support for this understanding for his understanding of gravity of the sins of David onwards in Psalm 51. David admits his sin and transgression. Wash me thoroughly of my iniquity, avonot, and purify me of my sin. Here he took the pshat. David was a sinner. In Yefet's view, the avonot that David confessed is the killing of Uriah and the sin of the sexual intercourse with Uriah's wife. Yefet's emphasis on David's sin was not in vain. Under the sway of the principle of prophetic immunity, there were those who narrowed the scope of David's sin with Bathsheba in order not to damage this principle. Again, problem with the principles of Mu'tazila. After describing the story in the commentary to 2 Samuel, Yefet turned to discuss two theological questions that are relevant to this story. One of them is, was the sin of David in the story of Bathsheba a minor sin or a major sin? Yefet attributes to the theologians the claim that David's sin was minor because David was a prophet in their view. And it is impossible that a prophet could commit a major sin because the principle of immunity. You can see source number 3. There is a group of theologians who claimed that the sin was minor and not major, and they supported themselves with the principle that they established that David was a prophet and God performed a miracle through him. As it's written, he invoked the Lord who answered him with fire from heaven on the altar. And it is not possible that a prophet through whom God performed a miracle should commit a major sin. And from there, it followed that he performed a minor sin. There were some proponents of the immunity of the prophet to sin who found a different way to account for the sin of David by denying that he was a prophet. The other way, in their view, the major sin that David did testify that he lacks of prophetic status. Regarding the verse of Chronicle 21:26, this is not a proof that he was a prophet. Source number 4. Others said that a prophet that was sent to the nation and God confirmed his mission, it is impossible that he would do major sin, and if he did a minor sin, he cannot have done it purposefully, rather made a mistake or did it during a mental lapse. And David was not a sent prophet. This miracle, of course, the miracle in 1 Chronicle 21, does not certify his mission. The prophet God was the one who turned to him and said to him to create an altar and offer sacrifices upon it and to pray to God for fire to come from the heavens to the altar. And the prophet did this, and the miracle followed the words of the prophet God, of course. Regarding Yefet's own view, we have seen that he saw David as a prophet and accepted the principle that prophets are immune to sin in the broad sense, and yet did not relent in his effort to emphasize the gravity of David's sin with Bathsheba. In this framework, he decided not to damage the principle of prophet immunity by determining that David and Solomon were not sent prophets, but rather righteous men, despite the fact that they were bestowed with the Holy Spirit and predicted the future. The sent prophet that God sent as a proof, hujah, to the creation is not like a righteous man who makes mistakes and covet. The matter is similar in regard to Solomon, who said poems and future things under the influence of the Holy Spirit, but sinned by taking foreign women. And this is how most of the sages explain this story, the story of Bathsheba. Ben Shammai has already shown that in Yefet's view, as opposed to Saadia Gaon, David was not on a high level of prophecy. Rather, things were said to him under divine influence, ilham, that we mentioned yesterday, a low form of prophecy. As Yefet said when interpreting the verse, the Spirit of God spoke his message on my tongue. It seems, therefore, that the minimizing of David's prophecy is what allowed Yefet to emphasize his sin in the story of Bathsheba. And again, it was for the women, as you saw, we showed in other articles. How did Yefet account for the verse that David sinned only in regard to the story of Bathsheba? We have already seen that he claimed that this sin of the census of David was a minor sin, since David did not purposely. How did he account for the verse that David sinned only in regard to the story of Bathsheba? We have already seen that he claimed that the sin of the census of David was a minor sin. Since David did not sin purposefully and even confessed immediately. Indeed, Yefet's view was that when the verse ascribed only one sin to David, it was referring to a major sin, the only one, and not minor ones like the sin of the census. Source number 5. And people ask about the verse, for David had done what was pleasing to the Lord and never turned throughout his life from all that he had commanded him, except the matter of Uriah the Hittite. And this verse testifies that he did not sin all his day, except in the episode of Uriah. And the words here parallel David's words, I have sinned, etc. Know that the explanation is that David knew he sinned at the time he did what he did in the matter of Uriah. And this was not done unwittingly, just like at the time the ark was being carried, another sin. But at the time he did not intend to sin, and therefore the sin is not mentioned in this verse. Conclusion. We opened our discussions with Yefet's viewpoint on David's sin in organizing the census. But since the verse in 1 King 15:5 stated that David only sin was in the case of Bathsheba, we examined manner that Yefet responded to these two sins and their punishments over theological perspective. We saw that in all areas, Yefet made it his goal to interpret the stories according to Mudasila standards, which did not place correspondence to the simple meaning as its first priority. Regarding the topic of the census, Yefet immediately disqualified the suggestion that the punishment was for the paying of the half shekel, since in his view, the taking of the half shekel was only relevant to the census that took place in the desert. Despite the fact that David admitted to sinning in the case of the census, in that he removed all guilt from the nation, Yefet disqualified this testimony of David. According to Yefet, the nation became liable for punishment when they agreed to be counted. In this way, Yefet saw fit to defend the principle of divine justice in the narrative. He says it explicitly. Yefet did not completely exonerate David from sin in the story of the census. And according to him, David in fact committed many sins. How then did he understand the verse in 1 1 Kings 15:5. This verse refers to the great sin of David in the case of Bathsheba, but not to his minor sins, of which there are many. This differentiation between minor sin and major sins was acceptable in Islamic discourse. Yefet advanced the view that was widespread in Shiite and Mu'tazilite circles, that the prophet is immune from sins, whatever major or minor. He mentions that there were those who attempted to minimize the sin of David in the case of Bathsheba, in order to revive David's immunity from sin. Yefet instead chose to minimize the level of David's prophecy in order to explain this grave sin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that Marzena's request that people deal with Yefet on historical books is fulfilled immediately. We should all have such instant
gratification. This is not a this is Ilham, not Wah.
Any comments, questions?
Thank you, Yoram. It's a very interesting case, I think. My sense is, however, and correct me if I'm wrong, of course, that at the end of the day, when you look at his understanding of the character of David, the overpowering exegetical aspect is the literal. Because at the end of the day, he cannot compromise between the theological principles and what is evident in the biblical text. And what is completely evident is that David indeed sinned. This is what the Bible says, both in the story and in the additional texts that you have quoted. So when I look at this from an exegetical perspective, and I see what you're getting at in terms of the Mu'tazilite theology, I think to myself, he is remaining, at the end of the day, a literary and literal reader of this specific story and of
about Bathsheba, not about the one.
About Bathsheba.
Okay.
And one, you see what I'm getting at, that this is what is leading him, or am I wrong?
Actually, to say wrong in academic
no, but in terms of your understanding of
we should. But what I want to say is, firstly, he gives the options. You know,
yes.
People did it.
Yeah.
By claiming that David was really a savior of Bathsheba. But as I said, the last comment here, after Marjana spoke, he was also a leader, not only a commentator. And you have to remember that not like Saadia that was looking, according to Emanot Ve'Deot, firstly to the Mashiach of Ephraim. He was, as a student of the Qumran scrolls, advocating for the house of David to be the Messiah. So he has a lot of considerations how to react to David and to his house. So this is in the end, I'm not coming to your conclusion that he was in this case a pshat by saying that there are. What I'm saying that he was really a good student like the others in Islamic environments.
But he's going at the end of the day with the pshat on Bathsheba. He's not turning David into a leader. David is a sinner.
I think that in this case he decided to do it, but in other places, of course. Okay. But in other places, it was the first example that I brought.
But there's that explicit verse that says that he sinned, so he couldn't explain that away.
Yes, and he said.
Didn't stop the rabbis.
By the way, Saadia said that Saadia said that he didn't sin completely.
Yes.
He was much harsher than Yefet. Yefet also said that he made a minor sin. Saadia completely acquitted him.
Chaim?
I'd like to interpret you in a slightly different way. And I very much appreciate your talk on this. Because the way I understand you, you're saying also that even in a literal meaning, theological principles intervene. It's part of the consideration, even when you try to read the Bible literally. Because the notion of prophetic, what you call prophetic immunity, fallibility from sin, it's not a biblical notion. It's a theological notion. And Yefet deals with it. He accepts it, and he has to compromise it. So at the end of the day, he's playing between this theological notion, the way I understand your talk, and the literal meaning. So yes, he comes out in favor of the literal meaning at the end, but he also doesn't want to abandon the theological notion that he feels is being compromised here, so he makes a kind of compromise.
Yes, this is a good interpretation. And I said before that also in his halachic interpretation, a lot of time he will say explicitly that he is divided from the pshat. Because he was a leader and he understood what will happen if he will go according to the pshat, like Mishawai al-Ugbari. So he was really, we are speaking interpretation, literature, but he was a leader and he knew what that people are reading him, not in the universities, but people that tomorrow has to do something. This is from the point of view of halacha. And here again, the influence of Islam is very notable.
Miriam.
Thanks very much for an interesting talk, Yoram. And I think you're exactly right. We're talking here about an imposition of theological beliefs on the text that he's reading. But I still think it's connected to context. I'll tell you how. And I want to put your words in a larger context. If we look at commentators other than Yefet, also, this is a particular genre of use of theology in exegesis, in which the biblical exegete who's reading the text that seems to him at odds with his own theology that he's incorporated from his surroundings, whether it's the doctrine of Isma, like you're talking about, or numerous other doctrines that, for these exegetes, they were just part of the truth. And the Bible was also part of the truth, so they somehow had to make it work together. And I mean, we find mamash shminiyot ba'avir in certain cases that exegetes are willing to do. I mean, here you made it very clear to us, and it wasn't such shminiyot, and it was very clear. But in certain cases, like for example, the exegesis of the Tower of Babel, and how exegetes, I haven't checked Yefet on it, but I checked some other commentators, and it's just amazing to see what they're willing to do to the text when it conflicts with their inherited theology.
Daniel Frank wrote a very important article in the book Sefer Chagai Ben Shammai, also in this, show this, yes, what you said now.
Okay, thank you very much.